do? People always want to ask you that. I go, oh, I got sober when I was 15. And they go, oh, cool, crazy. What were you doing? And it's like, then the answer is always very embarrassing. It's like, nothing, acid, pot, drinking. And now I realize, like, it's not really embarrassing, because the only reason it's embarrassing is because I've been, like, I want to say heroin. So that people will go, oh, I acknowledge that that's legitimate. But I don't have that story. That's not the truth. The truth is, really, the question is, why did you get sober? And the answer probably would be because I was a juvenile delinquent, and that was the way out that I found at the time. And I probably could take mushrooms now and be fine, but I don't know, you know?
That's interesting. That's really interesting. So do you ever think about exploring it?
Definitely. Yeah. I think we did talk about this last time. Yeah. But definitely I do.
But what keeps you from doing that? Is it this distinction that you have where you're a sober person?
For sure there's that membrane. I think about that a lot. This like membrane, you're like you are either you are or you are not.
Right.
And that's part of it. Part of it is a harm reduction best practices type of thing. It's like everything's good. You know, I know a lot of drug addicts. I know a lot of people that use drugs and have great experiences, right? But I know a lot of people that got sober and thought, oh, I'll try again, and then they're all fucked up.
Right.
I don't necessarily think that would be me, but I do know that.
Right.
And finally, I guess I worry about like just habituating. But I mean, it hasn't affected you. It seems to have affected you in the opposite way.
Yeah.
You're better.
But everybody's different.
Yeah, everybody is different.
And I'm not doing coke. You know? I'm not doing meth.
There's no argument for meth or coke. I mean, maybe even. There's no argument for meth. Period. That just doesn't. It doesn't. It's not going to expand your mind. Although I guess there's an argument for Adderall.
Yes.
Like if you want to sit down and write a script over a weekend, there is an argument to be made for that.
Might be a bullshit script about cleaning.
Yeah.
A script about organizing your underwear based on color.
Drugs are weird, man.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big drug advocate, big time. I think that they're powerful and necessary, and I want psychedelic experiences. Well, I've had them, but I always say, like, the funny part about taking mind-expanding drugs when you're 12 years old is that there's very little mind upon which to expand. You know, you're like doing these things that are like Ram Dass-esque, like, you know, deep diving into the fractal pool of existential reality, and there's nothing there. You're just like,
point.
It's a weird experience. Like you're having these freakouts, and you know your mind is bursting open, but. I certainly wish I would like the experience of trying that with an adult brain. Maybe it'd be worse.
Maybe, but I doubt it. I don't know. I mean, I think that what drugs do, what any drug does, is it alters your brain chemistry, right? And everybody's brain chemistry is different. So some people could use a cup of coffee.
Right.
And some people, it freaks them out. And some people could use some pot. And some people just... There's a lot of people that I know that they just go into deep paranoid fits if they get involved with marijuana in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
Whereas I kind of like that self-exploratory and examination aspect of it, because I think it's far too easy to be cocky. It's far too easy to not be introspective, or that paranoid feeling. I think it forces your brain to examine all these perhaps uncomfortable truths.
Oh, you're saying you like the paranoia aspect of weed.
I think it's beneficial.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that before.
I think it's beneficial because I think what you're paranoid of when you're paranoid, unless you're thinking the government's spying on you. Like I know a buddy who was a big-time pothead, and he started thinking that the government was waiting outside of his house with a car, and they were watching him constantly everywhere he went. And as soon as he left, they would come out of the bushes. Like, he got a little crazy.
Right.
But I think he had his own issues.
Yeah.
And he was also dealing with his dad was dying. There was a lot going on.
Well, that's one of the weird parts of drugs is that, and I don't think that I have this, you obviously don't, but one of the weird things about drugs is if you have latent mental illness and you get into your brain and you pour a chemical on it, it'll unlatent itself. You know, the dragon will uncoil and make itself known. I don't think I'm not worried about that for me, but I think that is interesting. I've seen that a lot. Like a dude's like 25 and it's like, oh, I think I'll start trying psychedelics or weed, and it just goes in there and it's like, oh, you didn't know you had that. Not that they wouldn't have had that experience anyway, but it's definitely a incidental onset of mental illness. Yeah,
there was a study they did about the correlation between marijuana and schizophrenia, because a lot of people have tried to connect marijuana to schizophrenia, and what they found is essentially the numbers are stable. It's 1%. It's 1% across the board. So it's 1% that whether they're doing pot or not doing pot. And so you can make that correlation, like this guy got into pot, and look at all these examples of people who started smoking pot and became schizophrenic. But that's just humans. Like, there's a certain percentage of people that just will become mentally ill.
That's the scariest thing. I have a brother who's schizophrenic.
Yeah.
And it's like the scariest thing ever. Regular kid, totally regular, sweet person, and then all of a sudden one day it was like, "Are you okay?" And then a couple years later, it's like, "Oh, you are done. Your brain is cooked."
And what happens?
Well, he was in New York, so I didn't see the entire uncoiling, but it's basically, it starts weird and gets weirder, and then at a certain point you're like, "Oh, you're a different human being." Like you just, giggling to himself, smirking, weird outbursts, just scary stuff, and it's like your brain turns on you. And there's no, it happened around when my dad died. So sometimes I think to myself, like, oh, maybe that was it. Maybe, in the same way you pour weed on it, maybe if you pour trauma on it, because trauma is a brain chemistry buster too.
100%.
And so I think that probably like popped the scab open or whatever that was in his brain. But yeah, a year later it was like, oh, you're a different person. You don't have the same personality. It just shows you how much of you is just brain chemistry and how lucky you are. In the same way you're lucky not to get, kidnapped by a monster at the library, you're also lucky that the monster wasn't living inside your brain.
Yeah.
Me too.
Well, there's all sorts of different kinds of mental illnesses, I'm sure I've got a few.
Right.
It's like whether or not they're beneficial. That's the other thing. It's like I was talking to Michael Irvin once, the football player, and he was describing to me what happens to someone's brain when they're in the womb, when the mother experiences violence. If the mother experiences any sort of violence or really bad neighborhoods or around traumatic situations, that it elevates the fight or flight response in the baby. So kids come out of the womb like predetermined to overreact to violent situations or dangerous situations. I definitely think I have that.
That's interesting.
Like I ramp up way too quick. I calm myself, and I'm very aware of it. So I control it, and I know what it is. But like if something goes on, like I hit red line like immediately, where it like goes from 0 to 100 miles an hour in like a second, and that's not usually manageable.
Right. Maybe that's a link to our earlier conversation about the patriarchy. If you can pass on incidental trauma to a child because the mom is experiencing violence, if a woman is living in the, infrastructural, like 2,700,000 layers deep of infrastructural oppression, then it stands to figure that a female child is born with a little bit of that trauma too, and a little bit of, DNA-based, like, maybe I won't fight that fight, or maybe I won't be pushy, or maybe I won't be a loud broad, or maybe I won't, argue because that's not feminine, or what I'm saying. And so all of that in, trauma, intergenerational trauma, which has been studied and proven, right, is maybe in every woman that you've ever met.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt about it. I think all of us have some form of programming. Have you ever been around a kid who has an overly oppressive dad? And they're handicapped by it. Yeah. Literally, like whether it's a boy or a girl, their life is affected by this overbearing person who's constantly engaging in manipulation and control of their reality.
Yep. That's what you get when you ever had I'm sure you've had a friend that's a drug addict.
Yeah.
The most tempting thought in the world when you have a friend that's a drug addict is just like, why don't you just stop? Yeah. Just stop doing that. Stop it. It seems so stoppable because it's so selfish and so like obviously the wrong thing to do, and you're over here doing the right thing with such ease. And what having my brother's mental illness, my younger brother, it made me realize is like you actually have the same thought when there's a mentally ill person. It's just with the next reality is like, oh, he really can't. It makes everything clearer, right? Like sickness, cancer, you don't say to the person stop, because you're just like, oh, you can't. Mental illness, you say stop, but then you realize you can't. Drug addiction, which is like kind of a mental illness, you say stop, and it seems seductive to believe that they could stop. And if you could really be compassionate and say, oh, he can't, that's like compassion nirvana.
Yeah, and you can take it to another place too with gambling. It's really the same thing.
Totally.
It's a manipulation of human neurochemistry. Like somehow or another, betting money on things gives you that charge that you can't escape the grip of it. Like there's a lot of people that are really, really addicted to gambling.
I've seen it. It's crazy.
Which is really crazy that the government has fucking legalized gambling everywhere at gas stations.
Right.
Those goddamn scratch tickets are nothing more than legalized gambling.
Right.
Lottery, legalized gambling.
You're not anti-gambling though. I mean, I'm for it.
I
by the way,
enjoy it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't do it a lot, but like before I worked for the UFC, I used to bet on fights all the time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But you don't have the bug. Or
no,
do you?
I
certainly
don't have the bug.
No.
I used to enjoy betting on pool too. I used to play pool a lot, and I would gamble on pool games, but it just made it more thrilling. I never got addicted to it, but you do. You run the risk. You run the risk. You run the risk of getting caught up in it, maybe to a lesser extent than someone who has an issue. Like,
right.
People seem to have inherent issues with it. Like it's like it gets you.
Filipino.
Ooh, they love playing pool and gambling.
Yeah. I mean,